James Grippando is a New York Times best-selling author. He's written over 30 books. He's the winner of the Harper Lee Prize for Legal Fiction. His fans are delighted, and I count myself as one of them, that criminal defense attorney Jack Swyteck is back. The new book, the 19th with Jack Swyteck, is Grave Danger. And I can attest to the fact that you cannot put it down. Welcome.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me back.
And I'm so glad that you're back. This is the 19th Jack Swyteck book.
19 and another one in the works. People seem wanting more of them, so I'm obliging.
Well, keep doing it. Before this book, before Grave Danger, Jack started back 1994. He was a criminal defense attorney in Miami. And did you write the first book as a standalone book, or were you thinking, wow, you know, this guy's so good, I can do 20 more?
So I did not intend for it to be a series. I thought The Pardon had a very nice, tidy ending to it, and I left it alone for about 5 years. There was a natural tension, though, in that relationship between father and son, because Jack was a criminal defense lawyer who defended death row inmates. His father, Harry Swyteck, was the law and order governor of Florida who was signing more death warrants than any governor in Florida history. So you had that resolution of the father-son conflict. You had this high-stakes issue of, was the client Jack representing actually innocent? Was his father executing an innocent man? And that was a lot of intensity for one novel, and I moved on and wrote 5 standalones. And then I had the same editor for 28 years, by the way. So this was about 6 years into our relationship. Around 2002, she says, you know, Jack was just a young guy. He was 28 years old in The Pardon. And she loved that story. That was sort of our where we really cemented our relationship. And she said, let's bring him back. And that happened in 2002, and so the rest is history. Now there's been 19 in the series.
It's remarkable that he has lasted this long, but it's also because the writing is so good and he's such a good character. This book had my undivided attention right from the start. And I want to give a little history here. In Tehran, there were these modesty laws, and in the year 2022, a young woman, Mahsa Amini, and I believe she was 22 years old, was jailed. She died, and her crime was opposing the mandatory hijab, not wearing the headscarf. This is not her story, but this is relevant to the story. Was this at all a spark to you writing this book?
It was. That incident you're talking about with Mahsa Amini happened in September 2022. I was in Boston. My daughter was a ballet dancer. She was dancing in the Nutcracker. And it was 4 degrees in Boston. And we were staying in a hotel on the Boston, in Copley Square, which is a big open area. 4 degrees, mind you. And there were women out in front of the Boston Public Library holding the signs, Women, Life, Freedom, which became the slogan for the protests out of Tehran that rose because at first it was announced that Mahsa had died inexplicably. It came out that she had been beaten to death for violating the hijab rules. And the protests that ensued became a worldwide phenomenon. I think if your viewers will probably remember it, there were women who, in protests in the United States, in Turkey, in Italy, across the world, cutting their hair as part of a show of solidarity for the opposition to these modesty laws, as they were called. But the modesty laws were enforced very brutally. They were enforced by what's called the morality police. And Mahsa, sadly, was the first. And the morality police took their campaign even into schools. 15-year-old girl was beaten to death because she would not sing an anthem in praise of the current regime. You know, and in all, there were 20,000 arrests, over 500 people were killed. Executions in Tehran increased by 75% in 2022 as a way of terrorizing people to stop the protests. But it was that moment when I was in Boston and saw these women in the freezing cold, thousands of miles away from Tehran, holding their signs, "Women, Life, Freedom," that I said, I need to write a story. And it wasn't, like you say, it's not Massa's story, but it's inspired by that.
It is inspired. Over the years, Jack's cases, he has grown, and his cases have shifted in focus, which I found it very interesting. Earlier ones, to me, seem more personal, more local. This one has global implications, and it's even hinging on the Hague Convention. We have a child that has been kidnapped from Iran by the mother. We have a father who is suing to return this child to Iran. So this is way out of the scope of what you and Jack have known about. What kind of research into international law did you have to do?
Yeah, so that's a great question because, you know, I knew that a couple things about the protests. One was simply the fact that women played such an amazing role in these protests. And in addition to all the forms of oppression and violence that the morality police imposed, they created a news blackout. And it was women, a network of women, who were sending text messages with photographs of the brutality and the protests and on, sharing it with each other. And that's how much of the news got out of the country. So I thought, well, this mother who abducts her child is not going to be some bad actor who's trying to steal her child from her father. She is trying to find a life for her daughter in a place where she can live freely. She lands in Miami. Then the question is, okay, right, Jack's a criminal defense lawyer. How does he end up in this dispute? Well, there's the backstory of Jack and his wife, Andy. Andy wants him to get more away from criminal law because she's an FBI agent, and somehow it seems like the FBI or law enforcement ends up with egg on its face in many of Jack's cases. So she's encouraging Jack to branch out. This case comes to Jack as a volunteer basis, which in many ways is the way it does happen. The lawyers who represent many women in these situations who are often fleeing domestic violence will take their children, come to the United States, and if they are sued for the return of that child, in general, the law disfavors abduction. And under the Hague Convention and under the approach of our State Department, abduction is disfavored. You have an uphill battle trying to keep your child in a foreign country once you've fled. And so Jack volunteers for this case, and that's how he gets involved.
If you ever need someone in an uphill battle, Jack is the guy to go to. Did you ever think, or did anyone ever tell you, this story is going to be too complex to put in a novel? It
has the basic. I appreciate that sensitivity, and my editor and I talked it out. And what we really decided was to focus really on the human side of it, right? Is the mother desiring for a free country for her child to live in, for the father not really understanding why his wife would do something like this. And then, of course, I add the normal twists that come with it, which is that it's not the mother, actually, who took the child. It's her younger sister.
You're giving away more than I thought, so
yeah,
okay.
It's not that. You learn that in chapter 2. So, so it becomes this interesting, very complex, but I think worth the effort mystery that unfolds surrounding Jack's fight for this child and a woman who's trying to save her future.
For something that could be so complicated, you not only make it understandable, but you make it compelling and so easily readable. Is there a balance between getting the legal part right and making it fascinating for the reader?
Yeah, there is a balance, and I can tell you, I took a little literary license with the title itself, right? So, what the mother must prove in order to keep her child is that if the child is returned to Tehran, the child will be exposed to a grave risk of physical or emotional harm. So I kind of thought, grave risk, meh, it's really kind of a lame title. So I brought in the component of danger, right? Which danger lurks at every turn in this novel.
Does.
So we called the book Grave Danger. So yes, there is, this is not an encyclopedia or a textbook on the Hague Convention and the law of international abductions. It's really a one woman's struggle with a 6-year-old child who knows that the stakes could not be higher. If Jack doesn't win her case, she can never go back to Tehran. Her daughter will be sent to Tehran and live the life that she's trying to avoid.
Without her.
Without her, forever.
You know, in the beginning, we see Jack and Addie, as you said, is his wife. She is an FBI agent, and they're in marriage counseling. And that throws me. I'm going, oh no, they're a perfect couple. So what's happening? Because this personal conflict is really important to this story.
It is important because Andy has been part of Jack's life now since a book called Got the Look, which I wrote in 2005. So she's one of the early cast members, and it is an ensemble cast here. Jack, and that's one of the things people enjoy about the series, and it's one of the things a writer has to decide up front. Is your character going to age in real time? And so Jack sort of does. There's 19 books. It sort of spans 19 years. He's married now, but there's a tension in his marriage. It's a criminal defense lawyer who oftentimes is going after law enforcement, and his wife is an FBI agent. And they've set up certain rules to live by to keep that professional conflict from entering their marriage. And because of, fans of the series will know, because of a couple cases that Jack has had recently, those barriers are not working, and it's putting strain on their marriage. And so they are in counseling at the beginning of the series. But I think that dynamic, every marriage has its struggles, and Jack and Andy are no different. And so part of their personal life of working that out is what goes to your earlier question is, how do you avoid making this just something about the law? There's an important part of the series of Jack and Andy's relationship that is incorporated into this story.
And I think this only makes it more authentic. I really do. Now, no spoilers here, but there's a scene where Andy gets a surprise visit from a woman whose husband is jailed in Iran. And the story is evolving, and things, as we said, are not as they appear on the surface. But you added a fact that kind of blew my mind, that 3 Americans are kidnapped or wrongfully imprisoned somewhere in the world every day?
Yeah, that is an actual statistic. It surprised me too. And the reason I came across that statistic is I took a training course on representing women who are in these international custody battles because I wanted to understand the law better. And the first thing I could not understand was why the State Department would not take a supportive role of a woman who is, for example, fleeing domestic violence and bringing her child to the United States. And the answer is the statistic you just gave, which is that if the United States supports abduction of any kind, in any context, they then, what will happen then if an American child is kidnapped and taken to Iran or taken to a foreign country? It's a quid pro quo kind of diplomatic stance that the State Department has taken here, in that even though they, for example, will oftentimes help the father in this instance find a lawyer because he's not the abductor, the woman is on her own, which is why, as I said, most of these cases, most of the lawyers in these cases are volunteers.
That statistic, and that comes to what, 1,000 a year. That really was eye-opening for me.
And as I was writing this case, people may remember in 2023 there was the release of the 5 hostages from Iran, which got national attention. But the truth is that those negotiations are going on all the time. It's just the headlines grab it when there's actually, finally, after years of captivity, an American stepping off a plane and setting foot on American soil.
It would not be a Grippando book without a courtroom scene. This is not your typical criminal defense scene. Tell me about how it's a little different.
Well, so this is actually something that sounds like maybe hyper legal, but it's not. It actually made the writing easier for me. The rules of evidence do not apply strictly in these proceedings because they're international proceedings. Even though they're in a U.S. courtroom and a U.S. judge is presiding, the strict rules of evidence do not apply, which means that judges can be somewhat creative. And the course that I took, the training course that I took, was taught in part by a federal judge named Judge Denny Chin. And Denny Chin became really well known as a pioneer in this area because he recognized that there must be some flexibility here, because ultimately we're dealing with a child's entire future. It's in our hands here. And so Denny Chin told the story in the training course that I took about how he wanted to speak to the child. Now, you wouldn't do that if I wrote that into a regular Jack Swyteck novel in a criminal courtroom, and you got the judge taking the child back to his chambers and talking to the child, I would get a million letters saying that just doesn't happen. Well, this actually did happen in the U.S. District Court in the Southern District of New York, where Judge Denny Chin took the child back to the chambers and related to the child one-on-one. And he shared with us a drawing that the child did for him that totally swayed him in the case, which the child, by herself, he asked the child to draw a picture of her family. And I don't want to describe in detail because it's a child's emotions coming through. But based on that picture that he drew of his family that she drew for the judge of her family members, the judge ruled in favor of the mother, and the child stayed in the United States.
Have you ever had to question a child in your legal career? And I know that can be both gut-wrenching and really risky for a case.
I've actually served as a guardian ad litem before, and this was many years ago. And it is, it is gut-wrenching and risky as a lawyer. It's also gut-wrenching and risky as a writer too, because I'm a father, and I can imagine where these children. The roller coaster that they're on, and you don't want to come across in the writing as exploiting that either, just for entertainment's sake. So I want to get it right, and I want it to be powerful and honest. But at the same token, as we were just talking about this drawing, you recognize the child also has privacy rights, that you don't want to intrude upon. So. So in that way, those were some of the most difficult elements of writing Grave Danger, really, was the courtroom scenes with the child were, normally I can do like 3 pages a day when I'm really going. When you're writing something like that, it's, maybe it's 3 pages every other day.
The book is filled with moral dilemmas. There are ethical challenges, and much of this is the pressure being put, really, to me, on Addie, on the strain on the marriage. But it is a good storyline. So I, for one, love that they have grown as a couple and as individuals. And in the same token, I am so glad that Theo Knight is in the book. I think your readers would revolt if he doesn't show up in every book.
Yeah.
Tell me about Theo.
So Theo Knight was, when Jack was a young lawyer defending death row inmates, Theo was the youngest inmate on Florida's death row. He was a teenager. And it turns out he's the only one Jack ever represented who was actually innocent. So there's a bond there. And he fought for Theo until, when I wrote The Pardon, DNA evidence wasn't that prevalent, right? So that didn't come out until later in the series, that the reason Jack was able to get Theo off death row was DNA evidence which conclusively proved his innocence. But Theo, what people love about Theo is that he lives his life the way you might think someone would live it if they'd spent 4 years on death row, and you're making up for, not just making up for lost time, but Theo's kind of motto is anything worth doing is worth overdoing. He's really going to enjoy life to the fullest. He's a risk taker, and Jack's not by nature a risk taker. So it makes for an interesting dynamic in the friendship. And Theo, by the way, is not in the first novel. That is a character that I created with Carolyn Marino, my editor, who's now retired. We talked over and we thought Jack needed a buddy, and Theo fit the bill. So the series really, for fans of the series, they know this, but it sort of goes through a cycle, right? The Pardon is Jack with his conflict with his father. Then there's sort of the Jack and Theo phase. And then Jack meets the love of his life with Andy. And so the later novels are Jack and his wife, Andy. But you're right. If I were to write Theo out of the series, I'd be in big trouble.
Oh, he's sticking around. Jack has grown. We talked about he's grown personally. How has he grown professionally?
So he's gotten more confidence, right? I think Jack didn't have a lot of confidence. He thought he was always in over his head as a young lawyer. Now that he's been at the practice and has a string of very important wins under his belt, he has more confidence professionally. Jack was a bit of an ideologue in the Pardon, right? And people liked that about him. An injustice offended him. But it offended him to the point where it really interfered with his judgment and his performance in the courtroom and his interaction with other lawyers. He still is offended by an injustice, but he's now found a way to use that as an advantage in a courtroom. That passion, he has sort of cabined it and used it to his advantage. And so now, where he might have just flipped his lid over something that happened in a case 20 years ago, he will now simply work harder and realize that even though the system is broken, it can still render justice if he's there for his client.
So wisdom with age, I guess.
I guess so. Yeah. Although fortunately, he's not that old yet.
No, he's not.
So I can keep writing Jack until my 90s, hopefully.
I hope so too. There's something that a character does in this book, and that is they take their cell phone and they wrap it in aluminum foil. Now, is that a thing?
I'm told it is. So it's funny because Kevin Smith was a friend of mine. Kevin, no longer with us. I miss him terribly. But Kevin left MIT after his freshman year because he was bored. And went on to become an inventor, and he ended up holding like 50 patents. And but he was also, if you ask him his favorite book, it was Atlas Shrugs. So he was sort of this, Renaissance guy. And I told him that I was writing a book called Afraid of the Dark, and I just went to him. I thought, Kevin, smart guy, science, and like, so, I've got a character. Actually, it was Jack. He was in London at the time, and he was running from the bad guys, and he didn't want to lose his cell phone, but he was afraid he would be tracked. And I asked several people how to do this, and some of them gave me like the most complicated answers about taking apart their phone and taking this out, and and Kevin's like, okay, where is he? Oh, he's in this part of London. It's like, great. Okay, there's a convenience store right around the corner. He runs into the convenience store, wraps it in aluminum foil. And I'm waiting for and then what? Yeah. He's like, no, that's it. That's it. They can't track him. It won't be tracked. So anyway, yeah.
So
Thank
it
Kevin
is a
Smith.
thing. It's a thing. Thank you.
Yeah.
The new book is Grave Danger. James Grippando, it is always a pleasure to have you here. Thank you.
Can't wait to be back. Thank you.
I'm Ann Bocock. Please join me on the next Between the Covers.